Welcome, everyone. I'm Janice Liedl, and I am chairing this inaugural session of this year's meetings of the Canadian Society for Renaissance Studies, being hosted at the University of Alberta, located on Treaty 6 territory and in the homeland of the Métis. The session is titled Bridging Divides, Cultural Encounters. We have three speakers presenting their research who will be introduced in turn. You are free to pose questions in chat as we move along, but we will save discussion until after all three presentations are complete. Our first speaker is James Bonar, a fifth-year doctoral candidate in the history department at Queen's University. He is currently researching colonial implications of mythical representations of the New World, specifically the association of Atlantis and the Americas within 16th century Venice under the supervision of Professor Nancy Van Dusen. His research interests also include cross-cultural encounters, the Atlantic world, and early modern intellectual history. James is presenting on Queen of Earth and Sea, Fracastoro's Epic of Empire.
Thank you very much, Janice, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. So my project is indeed entitled Queen of Earth and Sea, Fracastoro's Epic of Empire. In 1530, the Veronese physician Girolamo Fracastoro published perhaps the most famous Renaissance Latin poem, Syphilis sive morbus Gallicus, syphilis or the French disease. Interrogating the origins of the morbus Gallicus, Fracastoro's Neo-Latin epic commenced with a series of questions that outlined its tripartite structure. Book 1 began with an investigation of the varied accidents of matter and the origins of the epidemic. Book 2 delved into the origins of the traditional mercury cure discovered through man's great skill, while Book 3 addressed a new cure with the guaiac tree bestowed upon mankind as a gift from heaven. Despite adhering to the format of a conventional medical manual addressing the disease's cause, symptoms, and cure, a close analysis of the poem reveals a richer thematic complexity. While syphilis has frequently piqued the curiosity of historians of medicine, this presentation will shift focus from the disease to the discovery of the New World and Fracastoro's reimagining of the initial encounter between European and Indigenous Americans. Several scholars have noted that unlike Fracastoro's later treatise on contagion and contagious diseases, syphilis was of little practical value to early modern medical practitioners. Contrary to contemporary physicians such as Paracelsus, who investigated the French disease, Fracastoro distanced himself from the doxa that syphilis was Gallic in origin. In the poem's opening lines, he claimed that the unaccustomed disease ravaged all parts of the known world simultaneously, alluding to its polygenetic provenance. Presenting the pestilence as an international, if not universal phenomenon, Fracastoro worked against the widespread ideology which held individual nations responsible for the origin and spread of the epidemic. As Caterina Piaccioca posited, the double title of Syphilis sive morbus Gallicus itself marked the transition from the national to the international, as the unlocalizable universal supplants the local and the national. In syphilis, the French disease was a global preoccupation, a pandemic that transcended parochial medical models. As Jeffrey Ito asserted, syphilis has too often been viewed from an almost exclusively medical angle, which has obscured even the medical realities. In accordance with Ito's mandate, my analysis will investigate Fracastoro as an observant cosmographer and cartographer whose description of a novel malady disclosed new geographical worlds. Throughout his lifetime, Fracastoro maintained close ties with Venice and its most eminent intellectuals, including Pietro Bembo, Giovanni Battista Remizio, and Andrea Navaggero. An avid collector of maps and an intimate correspondent with cartographers and geographers, Bembo was the dedicatee of Fracastoro's poem. Dedicating his own seminal travelogue, Navigazioni e Viaggi, Navigations and Travels, to Fracastoro, the philologist and geographer Giovanni Battista Remizio characterized the physician-cum poet as one of the greatest geographic authorities of the day. A proponent of the American ideology of syphilis, the poet and diplomat Andrea Navaggero relayed Spanish reports of the New World to Fracastoro and his fellow members of the Venetian intelligentsia. The first Italian translator of Peter Martyr's Decadus, Navaggero furnished Fracastoro with two substantial treatments of Columbus's voyages while the latter was revising his final rendition of syphilis. Although Fracastoro regularly corresponded with each member of this informal global study group, it was Bembo who emerged as a critical interlocutor during the drafting of Syphilis. Between 1522 and 1525, Bembo read several renditions of what he deemed a beautiful work that initially consisted of 2 texts. Prior to its publication in 1530, Fracastoro added a 3rd installment detailing the origins of the mercury cure. In a letter to Fracastoro from 1525, Bembo commented that the first book has many beautiful things, even all of them, and it seems to me that you are writing in verse about things taken out of philosophy, very poetically and more graciously than Lucretius does in many of his lines. Modern readers may balk at Bembo's initial appraisal of the poem. Indeed, his promise of beautiful things stood in stark contrast with the subject of Book 1, the description of the conditions and symptoms of this dreadful plague. Fracastoro recounted that, when the contagion had passed through all the veins and had polluted even the humors and what was meant to feed the body, nature, whose wont is to reject what is harmful, attempted to expel the infected part from the whole body towards the surface. But because this matter had a lighter element more naturally inclined to erupt, which, as was expelled, made for the surface of the skin and the limbs extremities. Immediately unsightly sores broke out all over the body and made the face horrifyingly ugly and disfigured the breath by their foul presence. The disease took on a new aspect, pustules of the shape of an acorn cup and rotten with thick slime, which soon afterwards gaped wide open and floated a discharge of mucus and putrid blood. Describing the eruption of putrid pustules along the surface of the victim's skin, Fracastoro likened the syphilitic body to the geography of a volcanic landscape. As the author of De Etna, an imaginative ascent of the eponymous Sicilian volcano, Bembo was undoubtedly pleased with Fracastoro's characterization of medical symptoms as telluric movements, when he classified these horrific images as beautiful. Conversely, Bembo strongly objected to the second book and its discussion of the mercury cure. In an elaborate digression, Fracastoro related the mythical discovery of the corrosive antidote. In a deep Syrian valley amid the gray groves and shady willows, where Callirrhoe runs down, murmuring from her pleasant fountain, a keeper of the garden sacred to the rural gods, the keeper of groves and hunter of wild animals, Ilpheus, killed Diana's sacred stag. Furious, the indignant goddess punished the hunter's hubris by inflicting the disease upon him. Yet she alleviated his affliction by stipulating that if any salvation exists, it must be sought in the depths of the earth below, beneath light's darkness. Weary from this destructive plague, Ilpheus supplicated the gods to end his suffering. The nymph Callirrhoe responded to the hunter's plea and promised to guide him to the underworld to seek the cure. In an homage to the 6th book of Virgil's Aeneid, Ilpheus was escorted through the underworld by the nymphs Nipare. Leading the infected hunter to a previously unknown land, Nipare revealed the underworld to Ilpheus as though it were a new world. The New World itself appeared in the 3rd and final installment of Syphilis. Tracing the transatlantic voyages of the Spanish fleet to the Americas, Fracastoro offered an alternative cure for the disease, the guaiacum tree found in the territories recently encountered by Columbus. Christened Leño Santo, or Holy Wood, the guaiac extract from the Guaiacum sanctum was imported to Europe in 1515 and as early as 1517 was claimed to have cured 3,000 people. Realizing its medicinal and economic potential, the Fuguers quickly acquired a monopoly on the importation of the precious wood. Through their commercial acumen, the use of guaiac quickly became known throughout Europe, as the German bankers promoted its sales by actively encouraging the belief that the disease was American in origin. Book 3 of Syphilis thus introduced a new and rather controversial topic that was highly politicized in the initial decades of the 16th century. The transition from the 2nd to the 3rd book of the poem marked the leap from myth to a specific moment in history, the discovery of the New World that coincided with the emergence of the new disease and its remedy. However, the line between fact and fiction remains blurred in Book 3. Neither Columbus nor the islands he encountered are explicitly identified in Fracastoro's narrative. The only location whose name is revealed is that of Ophir, the biblical isle revered for its riches. Upon their arrival, the Spanish sailors are promptly cursed by a talking parrot for inflicting violence against the native fauna. The vengeful bird prophesies that the Europeans will colonize the new territory only once they will have been tortured and decimated by a terrible plague, syphilis. As they venture further into the island, Columbus and his crew discover that its indigenous inhabitants suffer from the same horrible affliction. Once the Spaniards sail back to Europe, they realize with horror that the avian revenge has already struck their continent and that the epidemic is rapidly spreading across its borders. Despite the novelty of its subject matter, Fracastoro's third book is eerily familiar. In many ways, it is a translation of the second book into the New World. Indeed, in both books, the author explains the epidemic's origin with human hubris. In Book 2, Ilcius descends to the underworld to discover an underground link between Asia and Europe that connects both continents through invisible paths that run under the Mediterranean. In Book 3, 4 continents are connected through Fracastoro's introduction of the island of Ophir, an island situated at the boundaries between Europe, Asia, Africa, and America. While Ilcius' descent to the underworld in Book 2 centers on what Teochew defines as the verticality of space, the landscape in Book 3 is transformed into a horizontal cartography, comprising contemporary discoveries within the Atlantic world. Connecting disparate peoples and places across time and space, Syphilis emerges as a poem preoccupied with the new geographic definitions and delimitations afforded by the Americas. However, the seemingly infinite number of new territories disclosed within the immensity of the Atlantic quickly transforms into a claustrophobic reflection of a familiar place, Venice. Projecting the image of the Maritime Republic into the far-flung islands of the Caribbean, Fracastoro transforms Columbus's fateful voyage from Iberian into a Venetian endeavor. Upon disembarking on Ophir, the Spanish settlers observed large flocks of birds that were all the time flying through the shady branches of the trees, ornate birds, their blue flashing wings contrasting with their red beaks, who passed untroubled through their native groves wilderness. Contrary to Columbus's logbook, Fracastoro's description of the initial encounter between the denizens of the Old and New Worlds is decidedly more violent, as we can see here. The use of gunpowder and subsequent carnage wrought upon the winged inhabitants of the New World recalls the atrocities committed by the conquistadors. Since neither Columbus nor Martyr acknowledged the use of firearms in their accounts of the Americas, Fracastoro's inclusion of them alludes not only to a crucial development in the history of warfare, but specifically to Venice's role in it. As John Gilmartin noted, it was Venice, long on cash and short of manpower, that first imported cannon into the Mediterranean from the European birthplace north of the Alps. Gunpowder technology was most advanced by the Venetians, hard-pressed by the Turks, and perpetually seeking to magnify the effectiveness of their limited manpower. There can be little doubt, too, that the arsenal, with its highly skilled workforce, gave Venice a well-capitalized institutional base for technological development. The Venetian arsenal produced the most advanced ballistic weapons and first unequivocal evidence of a powerful gun mounted on a galley's bow involving a basilisk, a generic term for a long gun of exceptional power firing a ball of 50 pounds or more on a Venetian great galley in 1501. When describing the disproportionate violence of the Spanish fleet manifested in the killing of the birds with gunpowder, Fracastoro transfers Spain's imperial power to Italy and to Venice in particular. What is described in Book 3 is not Spain's, but rather Venice's military power, weaponry, and ongoing warfare. The historical events at the beginning of the 16th century reveal an ongoing record of wars and violence involving Venice. In 1508, Pope Julius II, the Emperor Maximilian I, Louis XII of France, and Ferdinand of Aragon formed the League of Cambrai against the Republic. In 1509, Fracastoro's hometown of Verona was abandoned by Venice and occupied by a large garrison of Germans, Swiss, and Spanish. It was devastated by sack, famine, and plague. When Andrea Navigero asked Pietro Bembo to succeed him in the function of historian of Venice, Bembo opened the first lines of his history by deploring the ongoing warfare and bellicose atmosphere of its days. The Arsenal, a medieval shipyard that was significantly rebuilt and enlarged during the 16th century, turned into the city center. As Manfredo Teferi points out, the Arsenal was to become the state's bulwark on land and sea, a machine capable of acting as guarantor of the Republic's defense, of stimulating commerce and balancing the latter with the land reclamation and territorial conquests already underway. The Arsenal became the largest scale rationalization of Venetian territory to take place during the 16th century. For Bembo's student and Vitruvius' translator, Daniele Barbaro, the Arsenal was an apparatus to acquire kingdoms and provinces. The military heart of the city, the Venetian Arsenal was transformed during the 16th century as part of a larger strategic urban plan launched to organize the territory, hydrography, and lagoons of the city. Fracastoro was deeply involved with this topographical transformation due to his frequent correspondence with Alvise Cornaro. A patrician and urban planner, Cornaro proposed a series of sweeping changes to the lagoon in accordance with the imperatives of economic and military profit, as well as the aesthetic norms of classical beauty. However, his most intriguing innovations were applied to 2 islands in the middle of the lagoon. the first transformed into a shapeless little hill, and the other into a civic repertory theater, exposed to the chronic caprices of the tides. Securely standing in the Piazza San Marco, Cornaro spectator delights in how the island first disappears under the sea and then reemerges in a repetitive and never-ending natural staging of spectacular territorial discovery. Created with nature's help, the insistence on veiling and unveiling in the cyclical discovery play naturalizes the newfound possessions of the Serenissima rising from the water of its own territory. The vanishing of an island through natural catastrophes and cataclysms is also reminiscent of the Platonic myth of Atlantis, a myth that Fracastoro inserted into the third book of Syphilis. After the Spanish fleet has poached the parrots and have been subsequently cursed, Columbus and his crew encountered the island's syphilitic inhabitants. The people of Ophir, sitting amid a guaiac grove, tell the sad story of the origins of their affliction. Survivors of the sunken Atlantis, the New World natives bear striking resemblance to the Noachian descendants of the biblical flood. While both myths were revived and often compared throughout the early modern era, the discovery of the Americas drastically altered perceptions of the Platonic fable. As Pierre Vidal-Naquet argues, Atlantis itself could be interpreted either through the Bible or in the light of the great new discoveries. And these were all solutions that could easily be combined as well as opposed. The common preoccupation that united them was the now primary need, except for the skeptics, to locate Atlantis. Offering an explanatory framework for the Americas, Atlantis also facilitated imperialistic claims by creating, via Plato and its mythical and textual tradition, a link between hemispheres. While frequently envisioned as a physical connection, as in the case of the Spanish historian Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa, Fracastoro mobilizes the myth of Atlantis as a mirror through which the old world is reflected in the new. Applying Venice's regal sobriquet to describe their mythical progenitors, the indigenous populace recalls the Republic's imperial majesty in the recently discovered land. The location of the fateful encounter lends credence to this theory. Occurring in a hollow valley, the environment's concavity alludes to Fracastoro's considerable knowledge of optics. As Charles and Dorothea Singer remind us, Fracastoro was one of the few writers of his day who had any idea of the nature of the refraction of light. He is probably the first to suggest the combination of lenses as an aid to vision, and he thus gives the first hint in literature of the construction of a telescope. In his cosmographical treatise, The Homo Centrica, Fracastoro observed that lenses, through their concavity and convexity, create optical illusions and distorted images. After providing the image of an oar, whose example appears broken through the medium of water, he inferred that there are yet other media from which the species are in part reflected, but through which they do not in part penetrate. Some call this latter process refraction, distinguishing refraction from reflection. In reflection, the incident species do not penetrate, but are wholly thrown back again. In refraction, however, although there may be a degree of reflection, yet the species do penetrate and affect vision directly. Now such parts of the spheres as reflect the species render all objects larger and nearer. Reflecting on the creation and distortion of images, the reader is left wondering whom the Spanish sailors actually encounter on Ophir. The New World might be, so Fracastoro's suggestion, a mere reflection of the old. While Ophir is a place of reflection for Fracastoro and his fellow Venetians, it is also a locus for novelty. Within the confines of the Concave Valley, the indigenous populace informed Columbus that the first human affected by the French disease was the descendant of the Atlanteans. After refusing to honor the sun god and opting to worship his king instead, the eponymous shepherd Syphilis is subsequently punished for his blasphemous behavior. The son of the father felt indignation in his mind. He hurled his hostile rays and shone with a bitter light. By that glance, Mother Earth and the sea's flat expanse were attacked. By that venom, the air was infected and began to glow hot. Straightway, an unknown pollution was born in flood to the blasphemous earth. The first man to display disfiguring sores over his body was Syphilis, who by the shedding of blood instituted divine rites in the king's honor and altars in the mountains sacred to him. He was the first to experience sleepless nights and tortured limbs, and from this first victim, the disease derived its name. From him, the farmers called the sickness syphilis. Created in the tropical setting of the Caribbean, Fracastoro's syphilis functions as a token of linguistic imperialism, imposing a classicizing nomenclature on the New World. Transcending its strictly medical meaning, the pseudo-classical neologism serves as a linguistic equivalent of the sunken island of Atlantis, a metaphor that functions as a bridge between dislodged times and places, between the old world and the hesitantly emerging contours of the new. Thank you.
Thank you so much for our first paper of the session.